Here's another big correlation between near-death experiences and physics, is the light at the end of the tunnel. According to special relativity, which Einstein developed in 1905, if you could travel at close to the speed of light, what you would see is all of the light in the universe, even light directly behind you, get pulled and condensed into a single point at the end of a dark tunnel. In near-death experiences, that's what they say. I rose above my body. I was looking down at my body from the light fixture of the operating room, and then I'm floating above and I'm at the outer atmosphere of Earth, where Carl Jung said he experienced this Hindu in his big black rock temple. And then a lot of times they talk about, then I'm hurtling through space, through a dark tunnel, planets are whizzing past me, and there's this infinitely bright, all-loving point of light at the end.
Welcome back to the transmission, my friends. I would love to sit here and say that wisdom just makes the world a lighter, more unified, harmonious, glorious place filled with ever more love and light. But true deepening, true understanding, true transformation is usually, at best, quite a process. Sometimes just overflowing with growing pains and feelings of hopelessness, like you're never gonna get out of this dark night of the soul or something. This is why I think the first stage in the archetypal alchemical process is the blackening, this stage that exemplifies confusion and a lack of understanding. That really speaks to the truth of what insight first brings. Also think of the grammar of any kind of breakthrough, whether it's philosophical or scientific or technological. It often makes the status quo really uncomfortable. The scientific establishment rejected Einstein's theories. Einstein rejected quantum theory. And it makes sense, right? Reality is hard enough to make sense of. Nobody wants to have their worldview that they've worked so hard to create dismembered right in front of them. But sometimes what looks like disarray or negretto or dismembering is actually just a necessary step to evolve. Anyway, this motif of idea, evolution, and alchemy is fresh on my mind for a couple of reasons. For one, I just read The Great Passion of the Western Mind by Richard Tarnas, which really summarizes the entire evolution of Western philosophical thought. He will be in the Mind Meld next week, by the way. But also because of our guest in this one, Timothy Owen Desmond, because he is attempting to square that circle to bring seemingly disparate, even dismembered ideas together in a really fascinating, soulful, and novel way. In his book, he ties in ancient, esoteric, Platonic wisdom and Indian wisdom with the mythopoetic genius of Carl Jung and even modern theoretical physics. And with that, I've already been rambling for far too long, so all the links that you're going to need for Timothy Owen Desmond and his book and his course are going to be in the description. I say it every week, my friends, but it is because it is of the utmost importance that you tickle that algorithm with a like, a sub, a comment, a share. So much love to all of you doing it every week. We've also got over 300 mind melds that will only ever be available in the audio dimension. So do subscribe to Third Eye Drops wherever you listen to podcasts. I would also love to invite you into our Wonder Waters over at patreon.com/Third Eye Drops, where you can meet a community of other curious kin via our patron-only Discord server. We do a monthly Wonder Gym and book club. You also get rewards like stickers, pins, shirts, and more, depending on pledge level, over at patreon.com/Third Eye Drops. And with that, my dear friends, let's commence this mind meld with the wise, wonderful Timothy Owen Desmond. The last one we did really captured people's attention. I was so glad to see it, because your work is really fascinating, really unique, and ties back into so many of the topics that I'm obsessed with. Jung, the paranormal, Plato, Eastern mysticism, modern science and physics. It's all wrapped up in your work. And I'm so glad that it came across and that the audience was able to grok it, or at least enjoy it. So really excited for round 2 and to see where this goes, man.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. It was cool to see people were interested in that previous video. Normally, a video about Plato and physics and Jung is more popular, but it doesn't get that much interest. But that one seemed to catch on more than the normal. I think it was had a lot to do with the questions you were asking, the context you were providing, explaining it to your audience who's used to hearing you. So I thank you for that.
I do what I can to steer. I do what I can to steer. But um, anyway, we were just talking about it's always difficult to know where to start these big, sprawling conversations.
Yeah.
But I brought up someone that the audience is very interested in last time, and I diverted from going into his work because I didn't want to hijack you away from your work. But you said that you have looked a bit more into Donald Hoffman since we spoke before, so I can't resist um, asking you what your thoughts are on his work and his sort of main hypotheses and thoughts about the nature of reality. And as with any complex, nuanced topic, I feel like there needs to be a little bit of orientation for people who aren't familiar with his ideas. Um, you feel free to give that context, or if you want me to, I can do it. Either way.
Oh, I'd rather you do it. I think you're
Sure.
probably more familiar with him than I am, though I have been watching a lot of his videos and I've got a pretty good grip on his basic ideas. And I've got some ideas on how to comment on it, but I'd like you to give a little intro so I can
Sure.
refresh myself also.
Yeah. So Don was a professor of cognitive science for his whole career, studied perception, eventually came very technical. I mean, he wrote technical PhD level books on cognitive science and perception, and he has come to the philosophical conclusion that we essentially sense 0% of reality with our sense faculties. Rather, what our senses are something akin to like a computer desktop interface. And he calls this the desktop theory of perception. And essentially, what it is that when you go to your computer desktop and you see a button for Microsoft Word and a button for, you know, um, Google Chrome, those are just convenient images for you to interact with that will allow you to do something that you're seeking to do. The reality of what that is just stacks and stacks of protocols and ones and zeros and programming that if you saw the raw data output, you would not be able to interact with it. And for various reasons, Hoffman thinks that that is what our model of the world is essentially like an evolutionarily convenient construct that we need to operate in reality, but it is not a one-to-one depiction of reality. It's not, he literally says it's 0% of reality, and he has
Yeah.
technical reasons for saying this. So before you come at me in the comments with any of this being nonsense, do your due diligence on what Don is really saying. So that's part of it. And then the second major part of it is he thinks that beyond that evolutionarily convenient construct, there is what he calls a realm of conscious agents. So he believes that there is this realm populated by these things called conscious agents, which he has developed a mathematical theoretical model of and is doing work that goes way over my head about, and that we're going to be able to demonstrate the reality of this realm scientifically eventually. And that, and the bottom line is that he is kind of an idealist, a sort of idealist, and that he believes that consciousness is primary, material, and even the world as we perceive it is an illusory construct, but it's a construct that we require to survive, reproduce, etc. So I think that, in a nutshell, kind of covers Don's basic theories.
Yeah, I remember from watching his videos about that. I remembered his metaphor of the virtual headset, that
Yes.
that's how we're perceiving the world. And he mentioned that he's working with some other scientists, and they're talking about the amplituhedron.
Right.
Is a geometrical shape they're using to explain the interactions of particles when they collide and to describe that complex situation. So I was trying to think, and I was talking to ChatGPT-4 about this.
Cool.
How would that Donald Hoffman's theory correlate to the Psyche equals singularity equation, where I'm correlating the Platonic Jungian model of the soul with this soul in the central point of the universe and at each point of the encompassing sphere, the mother substance, and holographic string theory, which says there's a singularity in the center of the universe and that all the information is conserved at this holographic film at this horizon of the cosmos, and it projects in on these strings to create this cinematic hologram, that we live in this illusion. That's what Leonard Susskind says. From an atheistic, materialistic perspective, although it's his definition of materialism must be weird, because he's saying we live in a cinematic hologram. That's his own term.
Wow.
And that the past, the present, and the future are conserved at each point of this infinitely hot horizon of the cosmos. He describes it that way.
Ooh.
So if it's infinitely hot, that means there's a singularity at each point, because an infinite amount of energy that contains the past, the present, and the future of the whole universe means it's a singularity at each point of this horizon of the cosmos.
Yeah.
Which agrees with the Platonic idea of the soul in the center. In the Timaeus, the demiurge puts the soul in the center of the universe, which somehow encompasses the outermost sphere, which he calls the mother substance, which projects the material world into the volume of space like a winnowing fan, separating chaff from wheat. So that's Plato's vision. Carl Jung had his near-death experience of the same thing in 1944, had a heart attack, and his psyche rose above the earth. And when it was all said and done, he said, it seemed to me as if the past, present, and future are out at the horizon of the cosmos, and each of us is tethered to the horizon of the cosmos by a thread, as if we're imprisoned in these little cubes, these little boxes of three-dimensional illusion. So it's a really excellent mirror symmetry between Plato, Jung, and Leonard Susskind. That was my book, Psyche and Singularity. So I read some of Hoffman's work, but he's got a lot of mathematical equations. I was like, there's no way I can, which I appreciate. I'm glad he's doing that. I know Plato wanted that to be done.
Right.
A mathematical description of a conscious agent. Well, that's a fascinating concept. I think I have the formula for the mathematical equation of a conscious agent, because I'm saying Psyche equals singularity. And there's a mathematical equation. I don't know how to describe it in mathematics other than the infinity symbol. A singularity is a point of infinite gravity. And that was based on Carl Jung's leap day equation of 1952. Psyche equals highest intensity in the smallest space. He was trying to say, why can't we measure psychic energy? Because E equals mc squared. He learned about relativity theory from Einstein. And he was speculating in the context of special relativity and general relativity. And he talked about traveling faster than light. You would disappear from space and time, and you could exchange extension in space for a higher intensity. He mentioned infinite intensity. He mentioned no extension. So he concluded Psyche equals highest intensity in the smallest space. Mm-hmm. So the highest intensity is infinite intensity. Small space is zero volume. That's a gravitational singularity. He was thinking in terms of gravity. So in Donald Hoffman's work, he's coming up with mathematical descriptions of a conscious agent. I'm saying Psyche equals singularity based on Carl Jung's equation. And that includes the encompassing horizon of the cosmos, where people seem to experience the past, present, and future of the whole universe during near-death experiences, like the myth of the end of the Republic.
Yeah.
Even has the threads of destiny woven into by the three fates who represent the past, present, and future. So this whole world, I'm saying, in agreement with Leonard Susskind, the so-called atheist, is a hologram, a virtual reality, literally a holographic movie. That's how Brian Greene, the famous string theorist Brian Greene, describes it. He says it's a holographic movie. And he said that while comparing it to Plato's cave allegory, which he says holographic string theory is like an inside-out version of Plato's cave allegory, because the reality is the flat two-dimensional surface, and the three-dimensional world is the illusion projected from there. Whereas in the cave, the three-dimensional objects projected two-dimensional shadows on the wall.
Yeah.
And I remembered our last conversation, I said that it seems like that, but on closer inspection, the so-called two-dimensional surface is really infinitely deep, because it contains the past, the present, and the future of all three-dimensional space. And what they aren't obviously factoring in is it is near-death experiences of the horizon of the cosmos.
Yeah.
That it contains all consciousness.
Yes.
And I'm arguing
Man.
it contains all of the archetypes of the collective unconscious. It is the collective unconscious mind. And the conscious pole of the psyche is the central singularity. And the collective unconscious pole of the archetype of the self in whom we participate is the horizon of the cosmos. So we covered all that stuff.
Yeah.
But I'm just
I think we may need to unpack some of it again, because
yeah, that's a lot of stuff.
Even though I participated in the conversation, obviously,
Yeah.
and I pick up everything you're putting down, and I'm connecting the dots and all of these things. I think we might be moving a little bit fast for some of the viewers, but for the first thing I want to say, already a really interesting synchronicity, because I was talking to this guy Josh Schrey yesterday, who has an amazing podcast called The Emerald, and it's like highly researched, highly produced, thematic, and what underpins his own personal philosophy is very much a kind of animistic rebirth, and taking seriously the notion that we are not just these disparate consciousnesses floating around, that we really are connected to this field of consciousness and other intelligences, and what the ancients would have called spirits or daimons or gods or whatever. And without getting too into the weeds on all of that, so I just talked to him yesterday, and we finished that conversation talking about these ideas of sacred or primordial fire that seem to pervade so many mystical traditions and myths. You find it in I know you're into Eastern mysticism, and now I'm what is the Hindu or yogic like primordial fire? I forget what the word is.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of different words for concepts that are similar to that, but the
It's
fundamental one, and in terms of light, so there's Brahman, but there's also another word, Brahmajyoti.
what's the one that's like equated to heat that you would that's like one of the
Tapas?
three. Yes. Yeah, that's what it was. That's what
Okay,
it was.
yeah. Yeah.
And we were talking about like how there's like that in the inner sense, but there's also that in the cosmic sense, and there's also fire involved in any kind of transformation or purification or alchemical work. And also when you start reading some of the more mystical Platonic stuff, including the Timaeus, when they're talking about the Greek concept of the basic elements, the fire, water, earth, air. Fire in some way seems to be the most primordial and ancient. And when you look at depictions of the Platonic, cosmos, like the ones that we know are not like literally true, because there's like you have Earth in the center, and then you have these like planes of archetypal planetary existence coming up from the Earth. But the outer horizon, Tim, is fire. It's noetic fire. So when you get out of, so there's 7 spheres, 7 planetary spheres. This might come into our conversation later.
Sure.
The final sphere is like this 8th sphere, and I'll flash some art up here. But it's usually depicted as like this burning outer ring, and sometimes there are like these angelic, creatures dwelling there. And the idea is like that's when you get beyond these 7 archetypal qualities and you get to this true noetic realm beyond concept. I guess this would have to be almost like a non-dual kind of unitive kind of consciousness. I don't know, but that's what it seems like to me. But I can't ignore the coincidence that you're saying that literally it almost seems to be that the horizon of the cosmos. What did you say? It's like infinitely hot or something.
Yeah, that's Leonard Susskind. He
Wow.
said, now the cosmic horizon is only in existence, it's dependent on your physical position. So from our position on Earth, the horizon of the cosmos is where the fabric of space-time is expanding away from us at the speed of light. But as you approach it physically, it recedes with every step, just like the horizon on the Earth. Every step
Right.
you take, the horizon dips. But Leonard Susskind said, if you had a cable that was long enough, hypothetically, with a thermometer on it, and you could spool it out through space, then as it approached the horizon, it would approach the infinite temperature of the event horizon of a black hole. That's what he said.
Mm.
But if you were traveling out there at the same time, following that thermometer, it'd be just regular space. There'd be no heat at all. So people on Earth looking through a telescope that could conceivably see that far would see you incinerated and smeared out all around the inside of this infinitely hot two-dimensional sphere.
Yeah.
But you would just pass right on through a nowheresville, although you would never be able to get back into the universe because the fabric of space-time is receding or expanding away at the speed of light from that perspective. I'm saying during near-death experiences, when your body's on Earth, your psyche goes out there and you experience the past, the present, and the future. And you become one with this cosmic mind.
Yeah.
And that's where Dante, for example, put the throne of God when he was describing Paradiso.
Right.
And that has a lot to do with the mathematics of the hypersphere. But at any rate, it's infinitely hot from our perspective on Earth. If you physically travel out there, it would recede as you approached it. But if you go there as a disembodied psyche during a near-death experience, then you experience the past, the present, and the future of the whole universe. And furthermore, you experience these archetypal characters, like you were speaking about angels and all kinds of archetypal themes. And that's what Plato describes in the myth of and that is what Carl Jung definitely describes in Memories, Dreams, Reflections. To a T, he describes all this, that it was the most blissful, eternally blissful experience he'd ever had, these nightly visions after his initial near-death experience, that he felt he was floating in space in the womb of the universe, which is like the mother substance in the Timaeus.
Yeah.
But so anyway, about the infinite heat, it's important also because infinite heat means infinite energy at every point, which means it's a singularity. So that helps the Psyche equals singularity equation.
Man, there's so many different directions I want to go here. Like I'm tempted to go back to a little bit of Hoffman, but I also want to go deeper into what we're talking about here because I have a potential paradox that I'm trying to reconcile in my mind that I'm not sure if it's reconcilable. I'm also curious what you meant about the hypersphere thing. But also Dante or Virgil's divine and infernal hierarchies, it's the same archetype I was describing earlier, where you essentially have these 7 archetypal planes, right, where it's like the seven classical planets like Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, Jupiter, Mars, Saturn.
Saturn's the last one they could see.
And then Virgil essentially took those same archetypes and both made them divine versions and infernal versions from my memory. But anyway, let's not go back to Hoffman because that's just going to derail this conversation with like weird technical bibs and bops.
Right.
Like things like what is a conscious agent and like amplituhedron, like those are fun conversations, but I also think that they might just divert from the larger scope of this thing.
Well, I think there's one thing we could at least tie what we had said about him into what we're about to say, and that was that his idea that we're all wearing these virtual headsets.
Yeah.
That reminded me of Immanuel Kant, who said space and time or not empirically observable. Those are the a priori categories of thought through which your sense impressions are filtered to create a human experience. And then Hegel said, okay, but those aren't the space and time concepts we have from Isaac Newton aren't the only concepts of space and time you could have and causality. And he talked about how it evolves through history.
Right.
And I thought if you brought that into what Dr. Hoffman is talking about, because he talked about different virtual headsets for different people. We have a low grade one, he says, that only sees, in whatever 3 spatial dimensions. And another important point that he talked about is we're all participating in one conscious agent, that all of our interactions are really one consciousness experiencing itself. And that's kind of his idea of the meaning of existence. And so those were 2 points that I definitely agreed with. I'm not sure if he believes that each of us is eternally an individual, autonomous, conscious agent simultaneously.
Yes, I think so.
Believe.
Yes. Yeah. He said that death is taking off the headset to me before. He's said that exact thing. And just so it's not confusing, the desktop analogy is the same as the headset analogy. So it's kind of like you could view it as like clicking around on a desktop, or you could view it as literally your perception as me as Michael, you as Tim, as anybody listening. That is your headset POV. And there's some important nuances here because Don's not like a simulation theorist, even though this sounds like a simulation. He is a idealist in the sense that it's all consciousness doing things. And right now, consciousness, a conscious agent behind our corporeal reality, is experiencing as Michael, as Tim, as whoever. And to me, it's extremely Platonic. Like I want him to read more Plato, because if you think about there's and not just Platonic, but also any kind of mysticism that deals with there being some fundamental unity, but also multiplicity of that unity, because the conscious agent could either be the total, and this is where it could get technical, because he does have a technical like logically rigorous notion of what a conscious agent is, but it's both infinitely, it's like to my understanding, it's almost like a fractal in that it can be infinite in simplicity, like within a constraint. It's like the Mandelbrot fractal behind me. It's like
right.
you have infinity in a very small amount of technical information. Like there's equations that govern the Mandelbrot fractal. And it's
right.
so like that's one of the things that's just impossible to wrap your mind around, right? Is like we can contain infinity in an expressible way that you can like go on YouTube and write like Mandelbrot hard zoom, and no 2 videos will be the same, and they're all governed by the same math in different permutations. And that's kind of, I think, what he's trying to get across. And again, I think that from my understanding also works with what you talk about pretty seamlessly.
Yeah, that's why I was spending time trying to understand what he was saying, because he's developing the mathematics to describe this, which is so important to have mutual verification so that people can believe it, because the math is more easily analyzed in an objective way. And it does seem very Platonic. The only slight possible issue that I had was when I was watching one video and they were talking about non-dualism, Advaita Vedanta, which says that all individuality is an illusion. Really, the ultimate ground of being is Brahman, and it's this impersonal precognitive bliss. And it contains the potential for all individual forms, but those are temporary and illusory. And yet he clearly talks about supreme self observing itself through each of us, which doesn't seem to me to agree with the Advaita Vedanta. because the Vedanta tradition evolved, or at least developed, after Shankara, who was this Advaita non-dualist interpretation, who said that the individuals are illusory, the Atman side. It went through Ramanuja and Madhava and Chaitanya. And Chaitanya is the one who had this Gaudiya Vaishnava school of Vedanta. And his slogan was Achintya Beta Beta Tattva, which means God is inconceivably, which is important. You can't form a concept to explain it, but God is inconceivably simultaneously one and different from every expansion from God, meaning us. And since we're absolute parts of the absolute God, each of us is inconceivably simultaneously one with everyone else and different from everyone else.
Yes.
And that was what I was trying to glean from listening to Hoffman's talks. But at the very least, he believes there is one God. There's, it seems to me, one supreme conscious agent of whom we are all participants. And so I just like the way he's trying to nail down the mathematics to describe all that. That is Plato's ultimate goal. And I do believe Leonard Susskind and Gerard de Hooft, with their holographic string theory, inadvertently, unintentionally did what Plato was seeking, because their cosmology has a perfect mirror symmetry with Plato's cosmology. The spherical universe with the central point, the information conservation at the horizon of the cosmos, literally the strings projecting the illusion of three-dimensional space. And for Plato, the absolute eternal ideas exist at the horizon of the cosmos. This is hugely important. That means that's the collective unconscious mind. So what I am hoping is that Donald Hoffman's research will help to develop the mathematics to link psychology, specifically Jungian, Platonic Jungian, archetypal psychology, to that holographic string theory of the megaverse of universes. If he could describe the psyche, which I believe is a singularity, the interactions of how it manifests consciousness, I think that would be filling in the details of the loose framework that I think is provided by the psyche equals singularity equation.
Yeah.
Like, what are the details of how the collective unconscious archetypes at the horizon of the cosmos enable us to experience three-dimensional holographic forms here in the volume of space? And I'm sure Susskind and de Hooft have a lot of formulas to describe how that happens physically, but what's the psychological interaction to make it happen? I think that's where Hoffman's working.
I don't know if he'll get too into the psychology, phenomenology aspect of it ever, but I really hope someone does. I really hope someone uses, because I here's actually, I've never said this before, but here's almost my trouble with Hoffman, even though I love him obviously and hope to have many more conversations with him, is like, it's so personally important what he's saying, but ultimately the way that he's expressing it technically is not personally phenomenologically experienceable. It's not like his elegant mathematics and what, I mean, if you read that Fusions of Consciousness paper, or try to, what he's trying to do is, a Nobel Prize is not a big enough prize if he succeeds in doing this, because he's seeking to take bleeding edge physics and make the constituent parts of bleeding edge physics into consciousness. Like, so we're going away from, particles and materialistic reductionist concepts like space-time or like Hilbert spaces or even quantum particles, and say that there are these like rudiments of consciousness that obey or are physics in some way, and that those are what become physical reality eventually. But they exist in a, again, like, what do we want to call it? Like Platonic, hyperspace that's beyond space and time, beyond quantum Hilbert spaces, beyond anything we can conceive of. But it's also intensely not a personal or psychological thing. Like, it has the most like ontological meaning possible, right? He's saying, like, yes, consciousness is first, but the experience of what it is to be a human, like, doesn't, the day-to-day, like,
Mhm.
of how I experience reality doesn't change. So maybe that's not a problem with him as much as it is like a limitation, and that he's just one person, so he can't possibly, you know I mean, even what I just described would be a gargantuan, I think, generation defining uh discovery that would probably need to be digested for more decades before it was even accepted if it was sound theory, um
Yeah,
but I do
I
think
wouldn't.
that there are people who would carry that torch into the psychological and into the philosophical, for sure.
Yeah, well, when I meant psychological, I wasn't even thinking like Jungian psychology. I was
Mm.
thinking more like Kantian psychology, the mechanics of consciousness itself,
Oh, wow.
just which is the same for everyone.
Yeah.
What is the mathematical description of the process of the a priori lenses of cognition, like space and time and causality, interpreting the incoming empirical discrete experiences as formulating them into the conscious experience we have?
Yeah.
I believe that's what he's trying to do, create a mathematical description of
Yeah.
that process. Because he's saying these other guys who are saying that consciousness comes from matter, they have never presented any evidence for that. They have no mathematical descriptions of that process. After all these years, they can't explain how it happens. How do you experience chocolate? I think was one of his
Right. Yeah,
examples.
yeah. Qualia, yes.
Right. So, what I'm hoping, I do believe that the psyche, the soul, is what they call the gravitational singularity, because the parallels are really precise and it just makes sense. If there is such a thing as a gravitational singularity, and if there is such a thing as a psyche, they've got to be the same because they have all the same qualities as described by the ancient philosophers and Jung and these physicists. But the way that the psyche that each of us is, the gravitational experience, the gravitational singularity that each of us is, how does that point of infinite gravity have conscious experiences? The mathematics that Susskind gives us explains the projection from the singularity at the Big Bang and the projection from the horizon of the cosmos on these strings to create the holographic movie we perceive. So I think that provides part of that answer. But I think what Hoffman's doing is coming in from the opposite direction, kind of from within consciousness itself. And I just hope the two meet somehow. People who could do the math, I mean, I wouldn't even try. I have no, that's not nothing I could do, but I hope maybe people listening to your podcast who have the mathematical ability, if they could see some kind of parallels here, and I think it could be a connecting point somehow, and I think that would be really cool.
Another thing about, again, trying to mouth noise Hoffman's philosophy is like stretching my abilities. But one of the things that I've come to appreciate after having, I don't remember how many conversations we've had now, 4 or 5, um, is that you're not going to find the answer by looking through the desktop or through the headset. So when he sees people who are looking, when he sees physicists who are looking at like the Big Bang, or they're looking at searching for these primordial strings that give rise to subatomic particles and whatever, he likens that to looking within a computer program for the source of the code, right? So there's
Mhm.
something even more platonic that I am now just kind of connecting the dots on with Hoffman, which is that your mind mathematically and logically needs to go behind the veil, so to speak, or behind the headset, so to speak. Like, you can't look at things in the headset to try to explain the phenomena of the headset. There's something more real and more basic. And that's what he thinks these conscious agents are. So I don't know if you could square the circle between, like, holographic string theory and what he's doing, because he would look at holographic string theory and say this is just an art, this is just like an art, like a fancy artifact of the headset at best, and you're not going to find consciousness there because you're looking, again, he's not a simulation theorist, but because you're looking at something akin to a simulation. And that's like even more platonic, right? Because he's kind of saying like you got to take your mind to the realm beyond all of that if you want to see the deeper it gets extremely like platonic and even like in a sense like Gnostic and Vedantic, you know. It's like searching for the thing that's not there, or whatever. It's very difficult for me to wrap my mind around.
Well, that what you're saying, I've thought as well, listening to him saying that, you know, there's zero correlation between what we experience and what's really there, and space-time is doomed. He keeps quoting someone else who said that. Well, space-time is also doomed in a gravitational singularity. Mm-hmm. It's the point where physics breaks down. It's outside of space and time. It's the source of space and time. So much, it's so much outside of space and time that a lot of physicists don't believe in it, including Einstein himself, despite the fact that Carl Schwarzschild pointed out the implications of his own field equations for the gravitational field in general relativity in 1916. Schwarzschild provided the first mathematical solution for the gravitational field, the first exact solution. Einstein had an approximate one. That was December 22, 1915. In February 1916, he says, according to your theory, if a star of sufficient mass existed, it would collapse into this point of infinite gravity, and it would surround itself with a sphere where the inward tidal flow of space-time reaches the speed of light that we call an event horizon. Einstein said, nonsense. Just because my equations indicate such a outrageous thing doesn't mean nature will allow it. And then George Lemaitre, the Jesuit priest who came up with the Big Bang Theory.
Oh, that's his name.
In 1927. Okay. Yeah, he talked to Einstein. He says, look, according to your equations, space-time is expanding, something that Einstein was aware of and corrected for with what he called the cosmological constant in 1917. But to get to Lemaitre, he says, if it's expanding, that implies it is expanding from a point of infinite density. Because if you go back in time, it would be contracting until all of space-time would be in one point, the primordial atom, which then Pope Pius XII, who Carl Jung liked because he had this mystical idea of the assumption of Mary into heaven, he equated Lemaitre's theory of the Big Bang, which seemed to be vindicated by Edwin Hubble in 1929. So Lemaitre went to Einstein and he says, look, here's what your theory indicates. Einstein says, your mathematics are good, but your theory's preposterous, just like he said to Schwarzschild. Mm-hmm. And then 2 years later, Edwin Hubble, with the 100-inch mirrored telescope on the Mount Wilson Observatory in California, discovered that galaxies exist, that it's not just starry nebula, and that the galaxies are expanding away from us at a rate that increases in proportion to their distance from us, which is called the Hubble constant now. So then Einstein said, okay, well, that implies the universe is expanding. It must have been it must have been in an incredibly dense point, but it still couldn't have been infinite. That's ridiculous because that would place it outside of space and time. Physics would break down. It wouldn't make any sense. But black holes exist. We know that now. The first picture of one was taken, I think it was April 7th, 2019. At any rate, it was April 2019. And then the jets shooting out was photographed a year later. Black holes exist. The Big Bang seems to have occurred, the evidence indicates. So that indicates the singularity is real. But that pisses off a lot of physicists. Michio Kaku doesn't believe in it. Stephen Hawking did believe in it in 1965. That was his PhD dissertation that he worked on at the same time as Roger Penrose. Roger Penrose, and he had the same graduate advisor. Penrose came up with a Big Bang explanation. No, Penrose came up with a description of how a star would actually collapse into a singularity. And then Hawking said, oh, can I reverse the time dimension and use that model to describe the Big Bang? So that's what they did. But then Hawking heard that the Catholic Church had said that that's evidence for God. And as an atheist, I think he realized, you know what, that it does seem like evidence for God. Therefore, there is no singularity.
Right, yeah.
That's how he described it. His motive was that. And then he seems to have come back to it. But at any rate, my point is, to relate this back to Hoffman's work, a singularity is where space-time is doomed.
Mm-hmm.
Everything's doomed that goes into a black hole. Although from another perspective outside the black hole, everything that falls into it from the perspective of someone falling into it is conserved at the event horizon and leaks out with the Hawking radiation. That's fundamental to Susskind's holographic string theory. But the singularity is outside of space-time. So to equate a singularity with the conscious agent wouldn't violate Hoffman's claim that we live in a virtual headset, so how can you learn anything about reality through the virtual headset? And I'm saying the virtual headset, the hologram that's created by the virtual headset is created by the singularity in the center of the universe, which exists at each point of the horizon of the cosmos. That is the projector of the virtual reality. That's what we are. That is the conscious agent. And I think that there's a lot of strong evidence. That's my book, Psyche and Singularity. Yeah. I think the evidence I laid out there is strong. The parallels that Plato and Jung and Wolfgang Pauli, the co-founder of quantum physics, said we should look for, and Hegel, which I've been studying a lot recently.
Yeah, I want to get into
the best way to learn about the spirit is to study its mirror reflection in gravity. I think you can learn about something about the psyche by analyzing the virtual reality that's created in the headset. That's a point. I agree with him that it's a virtual reality, but I disagree that you can't learn anything about the nature of the psyche by observing the physics of the hologram. I think you can, because there's this mirror symmetry there. I don't think there necessarily has to be one. It's just that's the way God made it.
Yeah.
That's Hegel's opinion. So there's a lot to chew on there, but I mean, that's something worth chewing on.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And it definitely fits in with the sort of Platonic and later Hermetic and, Western esoteric idea of there being this correspondence that goes all the way from the microcosm up to the macrocosm. And there is some kind of very real self-symmetry going on there. I just did a video about this. The work might be starting out there. I'm not sure if you hear it or not, but
oh man, the tree trimmers.
Yeah. Oh yeah, talking about the symmetry between the macrocosm and the microcosm, and that there is some very real, not theoretical or philosophical similarity, but a singular substance and reality that underpins all of that, but then also these corresponding archetypal relationships between macrocosm and microcosm. And one of the places I ended up going in that video that I think fits into this conversation really neatly. And quick sidebar, Bobby Azarian, neuroscientist, wrote a book called The Romance of Reality. He's coming at this more from like a complexity theory and what he calls poetic meta-naturalism, I think is what he calls it. And his stance is that the universe is naturally creative and does have an agenda and is trying to complexify and become more conscious. So he's not like a theist in a traditional sense, but one of the things that was interesting to me that really, again, fits in with what we're talking about is that, to your point about how Hawking kind of unwittingly proved the Big Bang in some way, and he ended up not liking it because it sounded theistic. Bobby was saying the same thing. And again, remember, this is not somebody with some kind of religious agenda. He says that science has succeeded in proving God over and over again, but then ends up calling whatever God is natural, right? Well, it's natural now because now it's science and it's no longer religion because we can explain the mechanics of it or in the theory of it to some serviceable degree. So now it's just natural. So we just keep cannibalizing what was God under the banner of it being natural now. And that's, to me, total, like my I think the Platonic God, we could say, it's not limited to the natural, but it's extendedly natural because it's beyond the horizon of what I think we will ever be able to fully comprehend. Yet it's fully compatible with everything that's going on in the physical world. Like there's some element of that higher truth that is actively shining down into this realm at all times. And I don't think we'll ever fully ascertain or be able to logically explain what that transcendent one thing is that they always talk about through like negative theology. It's not this, it's not that, it's not a concept, it's before a concept, it's the concept of a concept. It's like it's all the like brain fuck language they use. I don't think we'll ever be able to fully capture that thing, but I also think that we're going to continuously, kind of like Zeno's paradox of the arrow, get closer to the infinitely distant object. We're going to get better language and better theories and keep getting more and more precise in some way. And that doesn't make it not divine to me. There are some people who are committed to juxtaposing the natural and the divine, and are, just committed to the idea that God is outside. It's not in here. And I just don't understand that. But another thing I wanted to run by you too is I don't know if you've thought about this, or if this has entered into your theory at all, but it has in Penrose's apparently. And as you and I know, and some listeners know, Penrose considers himself a mathematical Platonist, and he believes in the Big Bang, but he believes that it's like cyclical, and that the universe itself is eternal. And I was like, that's interesting. I'm not sure what to make of that when I first heard it, and of course I don't understand the technicals of why he thinks that. Then I'm listening to a podcast on Proclus, the Neoplatonist,
Right.
great teacher who we have tons of writings from, and they're talking about, well, of course, for a Platonist, the universe is eternal. And then it dawned on me, and I'm like, oh, maybe that's why Penrose is exploring this idea of the universe being eternal and having successive Big Bangs. Because
Right.
if you really are a Platonist, you've got to believe in some kind of eternality of the cosmos, apparently. So I don't know if that comes into play with what you talk about at all, but that's an interesting idea, because for the most mainstream Christian theologians, the idea of the ex nihilo, from nothing creation, this is why they like the idea of a Big Bang, because it sounds like that, right? It sounds like the Genesis creation from nothing.
Yeah, that's the Pope Pius XII uses that language. It's the creation from nothing, from the hand of God. So he's basically equating the singularity with the creative hand of God. But yeah, that's
so
the link.
Yeah, and maybe this is just getting way too meta for it to even really matter in any kind of practical way. But have you thought about that, and does the idea of there being a single universe with a concrete beginning resonate more, or this idea of this eternal, ever pulsating and I don't know, contracting, expanding into infinity thing,
Right.
feel more
Yeah,
true?
well, yeah, I do. I have an opinion on it. Einstein wanted the universe to be static and eternal, neither expanding nor contracting. So he added in the cosmological constant, which he later called his greatest blunder in 1929, when Hubble showed the universe is expanding, space-time is expanding. And then Penrose's idea, if I recall it correctly, is that the universe is expanding. It will continue to expand, but somehow or another, it'll expand so much it'll forget that it's expanding, and the Big Bang will start again. It was this really technical way he was describing how that would happen. Everything would turn into black holes, and then the singularities would evaporate. Another point to keep in mind from all of this is that the universe might be limited in its duration from our perspective in these three-dimensional bodies experiencing linear time. But from the perspective of a singularity or a photon even, there's no passage of time. So it comes into beginning and it fades out of beginning from our perspective. From its own perspective, it could be eternal. But the real point I want to talk about, this whole idea of a megaverse of universes, which string theory requires for it in order for it to make sense, or at least in order for it to explain why all the physical parameters, including the cosmological constant that Einstein inserted in 1917 into the field equations for gravity, have to be so perfectly precise for life to exist. The absolute speed of light, the fine structure constant, but especially this cosmological constant, which describes the expansion rate of space. They're all so perfectly fine-tuned. The number was a decimal point with 116 zeros and a 1. If it was slightly different, then life couldn't have formed. So it implies there's intelligent design. And I'm looking if I have the, oh, it's back there.
Yeah. This is largely what people, sorry, I thought you were looking for something. I was going to say, this is largely what people call the fine tuning
right
problem or argument, right? That, yeah.
Yeah, so here's his book. And there's a glare on there, but The Cosmic Landscape, String Theory, and the Illusion of Intelligent Design. And he says, yeah, it does seem like that. Just put that there. But the reason that it isn't intelligently designed is because there's an infinite, or if not an infinite, an almost infinite number of parallel universes. And all of the physical parameters required for biological life to exist are different in all of them. And when you have that many universes, then although it seems impossible, it's inevitable that some of them will have everything just perfectly balanced for life to exist. And that's his explanation for why there is no God, despite that it seems that we live in an intelligently designed universe. But the point that I want to bring into his idea of the megaverse of universes erupting as seeds from the quantum vacuum and inflating enormously quickly and then existing is how closely that parallels the Vaishnava school of Vedanta, which says that the material universe is just 1/4 of the entirety of the infinite being, 3/4 of which is the spiritual realm. Occasionally in the spiritual sky, the Brahma Jyoti, in which float innumerable spiritual eternal planets, each of which is kind of like Plato's idea of the good. It contains all of the absolute eternal forms. Yeah, they say, and each one of those is presided over by a Vishnu and a Lakshmi, a god and a goddess, and a many-formed monotheism, polymorphic monotheism is how this I've heard it described, or even more precisely, polymorphic bi-monotheism, many forms of the dual-gendered one god. In Vedanta Vaishnavism, it's Vishnu's the male side and Lakshmi's the female side of the god archetype. And the many forms of the god archetype populate these spiritual planets. And in some coagulated section of the spiritual realm is this causal ocean. And then one of Vishnu's many avatars is Mahavishnu, or Karano Dakashayi Vishnu, who lies down in this causal cosmic material ocean and goes to sleep.
Yeah.
And as he sleeps, from the pores of his skin, little seeds exhale and they inflate into these bubble universes. And then Vishnu incarnates again in the center of every bubble universe as there's Karano Dakashayi Vishnu, and then I can't believe Garbo Dakashayi Vishnu. That's the center of every bubble universe. And then Vishnu incarnates again as Kshiro Dakashayi Vishnu, also known as Paramatma, which is the atomic soul in the center of every Jivatma, you and I, soul, and all of the material elements. And furthermore, the outermost sphere of each of these bubble universes is called the Akasha. So we were talking about these spheres of elements, earth, water, fire, air. And in some models, it's the planetary orbits. Plato uses both.
Mm-hmm.
And then ether, they call it, translated as, or Akasha. And the past, the present, and the future are conserved in this Akashic outermost sphere from which the reality inward is projected in one of the Upanishads, the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, they talk about the fundamental strings from the Akasha. Yeah, that the past, present, and future are interwoven at the Akasha, and that we are projections of this fundamental string, a sutratman. Sutra is thread, and Atman is soul. So they have all of these fundamental ingredients that Plato has, plus the parallel universes that Susskind talks about.
Is this the same as like Indra's net of jewels as well? Or is that a different mythological layer?
So Indra's a demigod, and there's an Indra in every one of these universes. So the demigods are posts that souls can reincarnate into. There's an Indra in every parallel universe. There's a Brahma, who would be equivalent, I think, to the demiurge in Plato's Timaeus.
Yeah, it seems like it, yes.
Yeah, the original demigod, who's born at the top of the universe on the lotus flower stemming from Garbhodakashi, Vishnu's navel.
Yeah. There's a visual, people... the famous visual is that Vishnu is sleeping and there's like a lotus growing out of Vishnu, and then on top of the lotus, like somehow Brahma is born from the lotus, and Brahma is this like all pervasive divine mind kind of presence.
Yeah, Brahma is the demigod, and it's related and often gets confused with Brahman, which is the cosmic flip side of Atman. So Brahman is just infinite being, the ground of being. Atman is the individual particle subjective aspect of Brahman. It's inconceivably simultaneously Atman and Brahman.
Right, yeah.
And that is reflected in the particle wave paradox of quantum mechanics, which was discovered by the two-slit experiment in 1927. When you observe, you're simultaneously a particle, a subjective point of view, eternally Atman, and inconceivably you're simultaneously a wave in an ocean of impersonal precognitive bliss that contains the potential for all individual forms to be experienced. And in the Bhagavad Gita, this world is considered to be the tree that grows upside down, which is a metaphor for a mirror reflection of a tree on a body of water, because the leaves seem to go down, the roots seem to go up. It's the same idea of looking for the mirror symmetry between the physical world and the psychic world. The Atman-Brahman paradox is reflected in the fundamental ground of quantum mechanics, particle wave. String theory says the particles are even more fundamental strings, which wrap around compactified dimensions of space to create the particles we perceive. But to bring this back to what you were talking about earlier, you said Hoffman's theory doesn't have any kind of explanation for the intensely personal nature of consciousness. One way I see this megaverse of parallel universes as the dream of God is that we live in the unconscious mind of God, which is something Carl Jung speculated about in Answer to Job.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something I talk about in the class, Immortality and the Unreality of Death, a hero's journey through philosophy, psychology, and physics. We talked about Ernest Becker. He says the number one motivating force of the human species is the fear of death.
Yeah.
He said that's because we have consciousness, which can turn back in on itself and reflect its own active consciousness. Animals are aware, but they're not aware that they're aware. We are, and we have symbolic knowledge, he said. And we can contemplate eternity and infinity, and we want to live forever. And then we have this horrific realization we're going to die. And when we're thrust into this world where the predominant worldview is just atheistic and materialistic, we freak out and we try to compensate because we want to live forever. So we try to do these heroic things to imprint our name on reality to live in some other kind of a way. If we don't have eternal souls, well, then I'll carve my name into reality in some evil way. And I think these parallels between physics and psychology and theology make it more and more believable and more reasonable to believe that we are these eternal conscious agents. We are eternal souls. Why does it seem random and evil? Well, that's a really good question. And I think a really good answer is that we live in God's subconscious mind. If God's really a person and we're absolute parts and parcels of God, as twisted as our psychology is, as Freud and Jung were well aware, as dark as the shadow we have is that just unique to us? God doesn't experience that. If we're absolute parts of this absolute God, then the whole has all of the qualities of every part. So if we have a kind of a twisted subconscious mind, imagine how twisted God's subconscious mind. God is each of us. God is you. God is me. God is everyone.
Yeah.
I said, oh, do you think God doesn't have a sense of humor? Well, God is at least as funny as Richard Pryor. When I was a kid, that he was the funniest man on the earth. I said, you don't think God is, a good athlete? He's at least as good as whoever, Muhammad Ali is a boxer, or he's at least as good as whatever highest level being. He's at least as good of a physicist as Einstein, because he is all of these people.
Right.
Well, if he's got all those qualities and he's manifesting them through those people and us and you and me, then I'd imagine he's got a very interesting subconscious mind. And I think we live in it. And all of the tragic things we do is manifesting God's own psychic issues that are being worked out. And he's got Lakshmi. So there's infinitely fertile soil for psychological issues, the male and female side of God. We are reflections of that realm. And more specifically, I think we are the subconscious manifestation. So that in Jung's map, there's the conscious mind, then there's the personal subconscious mind, and then there's the collective unconscious mind. And in the book and in the class, I equate the conscious aspect of the archetypal self with the central singularity, the collective unconscious aspect of the archetypal self with the horizon of the cosmos. But the three-dimensional volume of space, the holographic illusion, the cinematic hologram, that's the personal subconscious mind of each of us and of God, the actual goings-on of these holographic forms interacting through three dimensions of space along a passion-filled timeline. Our subconscious mind exists there. When you have a near-death experience, you rise above the earth, your disembodied psyche, and you recall your life. You have a life review. And then because the light that describes our lives here on earth is radiating out into space, the information is still out there. So our actual incarnate earthly bodies that we're in right now, our whole history from our birth and before is recorded. It's hurtling out toward the horizon of the cosmos at the speed of light. It'll take a long time to get there. So all of the information of the three-dimensional forms is located at each point of the horizon of the cosmos, but it's also embodied in the volume of space. If that's the subconscious mind of God, it just helps us find meaning in a believable way that can take into account things like Freud and Jung and the best physics available. Is it really sophisticated of me as an educated human being in the 21st century to believe in God? How does that make sense? I mean, isn't God some judge? He's a big daddy and he's saying, no, don't do this. And I'm saying that's one, elementary, rudimentary level of understanding God. But if you want to get deeper and psychoanalyze God, like Carl Jung did in answer to Job, why was God so vicious and mean to Job? What's going on with that? And his conclusion was maybe God has an unconscious mind, and that would go a long ways to describing evil in the world. So I talk about that in this book, the class, which is now available for free on YouTube, so people can watch it. It's 18 hours where I go through my book.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, Psyche and Singularity, the concepts there. And I say, look, Psyche and Singularity provides an answer to Ernest Becker's conundrum. You must believe in God. He's saying he distilled all of 20th century psychology into its kernel of truth, which he equated with Soren Kierkegaard's idea that we need to take a leap of faith in God. Mm-hmm. Forget about reason. By virtue of the absurd, you must take a leap of faith in God. Pascal's wager said something similar to that. And I'm saying you have to take a leap of faith, yes. But it's better if you take a leap of faith from as strong a foundation of science as you possibly can, and including psychology. And when you combine Jungian, Freudian psychology with holographic string theory, and you have this model of the cosmos and the model of the psyche, The next level is to start to, well, what's the psychology of God? What's my purpose in relation to God? Which is what Ernest Becker says. We must see ourselves as heroes performing on the cosmic stage for God, that our heroics must be appreciated by an infinitely powerful observer. Otherwise, it doesn't satisfy our infinite imagination. And I'm saying one way we can heroically see ourselves serving God is by being God's psychoanalysts. Like, history is a study of the neurosis of God manifesting through the human species and the animal species. Because if you've ever looked at nature programs, there's some horrific things going on.
Yeah, for sure.
What does that say about God? There's some horrific things happening every day. Lift any rock, turn over any log, and you're going to be seeing just life and death struggle. And I believe that we are living in the psychodynamics of God.
Yeah, that's definitely one way to look at it. I think a lot of people have trouble swallowing that version of God. I'm sure you've heard some of Jung's riffs on Abraxas and how, the sort of standard view of the God that's only good from like the human perspective of what it means to be good is this very kind of like unfinished childish idea, because if you have a being that is fully complete, it encapsulates like both the darkness and the light to the maximum. But yeah, so he talks about, this like God above God being like superfluous, like good beyond all imagining, as well as evil. And it's above, it has to be both of those concepts and above and transcending both of those concepts for it to truly be God. That's one way to look at it. I think another way to look at it is that essentially, like the Timaeus lays this out, is that you do have something that is transcendently good and perfect, which is the first cause of everything. And then you also have these noetic realms of eternal qualities and who knows what else. And this is where the Platonic eidos come from, the archetypes, the ideals come from. But when you start creating things that live in a universe of anima, of movement, and of coming and going, you naturally get the problem of evil. Because if you have physical things that are in motion, that are interacting, and they're coming in and out of being, that in and of itself appears to be evil. From this, like in an Earnest, I've never tied Ernest Becker into this, but lamenting. I mean, I wrote this quote down by Ernest Becker. This is the terror, to have emerged from nothing, to have a name, a consciousness of self, deep inner feelings, an excruciating inner yearning and self-expression, and with all this, yet to die. And
Yeah.
let's give him some credit, because I think he died at 49 of colon cancer and was probably
He just turned 50.
Yeah. And he posthumously got a Pulitzer Prize for, or was it a Nobel Prize? Is there a Nobel Prize for writing?
1973, I think the book came out.
Yeah. Is there even a Nobel Prize for writing? I don't know.
It would make my class worth more, but I don't think so. I think it was just a measly Pulitzer. So.
Yeah. But yeah, and what he's very. The denial of death is a really complete, even for my like not deep reading of it, is really complex, because he talks about a lot of these things that human beings feel compelled to do as sort of a reaction to what I was just describing, like the horror of understanding that you are finite. So therefore we try to be heroic. We try to do things that will outlast us, or we try to become these, big, powerful, successful figures that will be remembered, or we make big families, or we make these religions and stuff like that. And he's saying that he's trying almost in that kind of like Freudian reductionistic way of bringing everything down. He's kind of saying like all of this really is kind of a reaction to the fact that we're going to die. But then a lot of people,
Right.
I think, get it wrong when they try to say that he is arguing for like a nihilistic, atheistic kind of
No,
existentialism, because
the
he's
opposite.
not. But it's like he's kind of, it seems to me anyway, that he's saying essentially you've got to bow to the mystery in all of its uncertainty, because that's kind of all you can do, and make there's some line about like you have to make an offering of your of your life, essentially, right, to the mystery, because there's nothing else to do about it. And I really like that it's not coming to some conclusion like, but when you really weigh the totality of the mysterium tremendum and the mysterium fascinosum, it should make you get on your fucking knees, man. It really should, because you just don't know, and you're probably never gonna know, and that's kind of the best we can do, I think. But I also don't want it to sound defeatist, because I think that there is real progress to be made, and I do think that like these all these people we're talking about today, these physicists, these philosophers, there something is blooming and moving forward like throughout the course of human history. And
Hmm.
yeah, we'll be forgotten as individuals, but whatever that fire that's going from generation to generation is, we can all contribute to that like meta individuation, or that meta evolution in some small incremental way, and that excites me. And I think that's something that all of these thinkers, maybe not all of them, but I know Plato realized it. I know Socrates realized it. Um, Jung definitely realized it. He talks about carrying, there's like some beautiful writing of his where he's talking about like, I've become very protective of this flame, and everything is about this flame, and I have to carry this
Yeah.
flame into my death. And until then, like this flame is everything I do is like for this flame. So sort of something along those terms. And that's exactly what he was talking about.
Yeah, and he wasn't the only one. Plato had Socrates recall what he heard from the priestess Diotima in the symposium,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
where they're having the banquet and they're each saying, all right, we're going to have a contest and who can give this best speech on love. What is love? And Socrates says, well, I'm going to tell you what I learned from Diotima. And she begins by saying everything has an undying thirst for immortality, because we want what's beautiful and good, but we want it forever. So to have it forever, we must be immortal. And that explains, she said, this extremely overpowering lust for propagation in the physical world, because that's the only way material bodies can participate in eternality, is through physical procreation. So that's why the sex drive is so strong, she says. But in the human species, the more noble you are, the more intensely you will strive for immortality and fame, to win the deathless role, the deathless name of fame in the roll of history, or something like that. So she was agreeing with what Becker was saying, that there's this drive for immortality. But she was celebrating it. And she was saying that's because you are part of this supreme idea of the good. You are immortal. You are eternal. Your body's not, but your true self is. And you can learn about this absolute source of being by ascending the ladder of beauty, from desiring beautiful individual things like individual bodies of human beings, which is the metaphor they were using in this context. And then you'll see how, oh, this beautiful person, there's another beautiful person. That implies there's some idea of beauty that institutions can participate in. And you go up this ladder until you get to the idea of beauty itself, and the idea of truth and justice and goodness, this brilliant source of all of the archetypes. And that then you'll be worthy to put on immortality, she says, when you perceive that you're part of this. And in the Republic, it's called the idea of the good. And we are one with the idea of the good. That's like the gravitational singularity. It's this infinitely bright source of light in the physical world, and of truth and consciousness in the intelligible world of the psyche. So I believe we are undying and eternal. And that's why we have says Becker. And Becker was just saying, whether there's a God or not, whether there's a soul or not, at any rate, I know this, the psychologists like Otto Rank and William James, and of course, Carl Jung, were all saying, we have this drive for immortality. So if there's no God, then we're screwed, because we have, the only way we can be healthy is to believe that we are immortal servants of God. He kept pointing back to Kierkegaard, the Christian theologian. And so I'm saying that the implications of the Psyche equals singularity equation, which are derived mainly from Jung and the parallels with holographic string theory, gives us reasons why we should believe that we really are these eternal, heroic servants of God. And it provides the world, the cosmic stage upon which to perform our heroics. We live in a movie. Talk about performing your heroics. We're on, and the world stage is literally compared by the guy who came up with this theory to a cinematic hologram, a holographic movie. Becker was saying we are all narcissistic.
Yeah.
That we're all absolutely infinitely self-absorbed. I said, oh, what a coincidence. The psyche is a singularity. In a black hole, it's infinitely self-absorbed. It contracts into itself at an infinite rate, and it absorbs anything that gets near it. And then he says, another part of psychology is that we project ourselves onto everyone we see. We project our shadow, but we also project the God image onto other people, which is why we worship cult heroes and things like that. And I said, oh, there again, the singularity projects all of being from the central point, and it projects all of being in from the horizon of the cosmos to create the cinematic hologram that we're living in. Projection is a natural part of the psyche, because projection is the essence of the singularity that the psyche is. It projects space-time into being. So I was just pointing out all the correlations with the Jung-Susskind parallel and what Becker was saying we need to believe in. And he was saying, this is our problem. Here's what we need to believe to be healthy. And it seems impossible in the context of current science. But we must believe we are eternal cosmic heroes performing for God. And that only projecting ourselves into the role of servants of this God can we satisfy our infinite narcissism, because now we can believe we're infinitely important because we're being appreciated by an infinitely powerful God. It enables us to project all of our archetypes safely onto the idea of God. If you try to project those archetypes onto anyone else, you're going to end up with a Hitler or a Stalin or whatever. So you need to believe in God to project your archetypes onto God. And he was just saying, what a shame. It seems that there's no God. And if we want to be healthy as a society and quell this fear of death, we need to believe in the things that I'm saying are much easier to believe in the context of the psyche equals singularity equation.
Yeah. Yeah. So much there that I want to riff on and follow up on. I think I also found this quote from Jung too, that I think dovetails in here. And it's that quote, seen in the correct psychological perspective, death is not an end, but a goal, and life's inclination toward death begins as soon as the meridian is passed. So this definitely fits in with this idea that I was talking about of like building, and again, we're back to this fire concept, right? Of like finding this fire that is the sort of nucleus of your individuation in Jung's term, like this thing that you kindle for your whole life, that you build, that is like the essence of who you are underneath all of the trappings of the, whatever life is foisting onto you, whatever you've done that you feel is truly unique to you and is truly the pinnacle of what you can express in this life. And if you're living in tune with that, death is not an end but a goal, right? Because your goal is for that to be the sort of climactic moment of the fire that you've built, right? Like that you've done all this work, you've suffered all the slings and arrows of life, yet you still managed to carry this fire into your death. And if you can do that, you've done the goal, right? Like you've done exactly what you were supposed to do as a being. And I think that that satisfies that heroic impulse, but it's also very realistic. And it doesn't have to even be grandiose. You know, it could be like whatever your calling is, whatever you're obsessed with, whatever your consciousness is like uniquely turned on by, you can follow that to its end and become great at it, or at least pour yourself into it. And it really matters on some kind of psycho spiritual level.
Yeah. If to bring it back to the idea that we're living in God's subconscious mind, that implies, I think God is transcendent and eternal and infinitely blissful and knowledgeable. And from God's perspective, what we're experiencing is the passage of time. God perceives each point simultaneously. So to say God is some kind of a neurotic weakling or something, I'm not saying that, but we are neurotic weaklings and we're reflections of God. So in some sense, we're manifesting that aspect of God. And so just taking care of your own psychological health is serving God, because you're a part of God and you want to make God healthy. To help God's eternal health manifest, we experience it as a dynamic process. God experiences it as a complete fact, but that doesn't mean it doesn't take sacrifice. Somehow the eternally fixed reality of God's perfection requires the heat of tapas, of sacrifice. That's the word generated by the asceticism of a yogi, creates this psychic heat, which can be used for doing anything. A lot of the demons will generate so much tapas that Brahma has to come down and say, stop doing that. You're shaking the foundations of the universe. What do I got to give you to get you to stop? Okay. I want to live forever. Well, I can't do that. Only Vishnu can do that. Okay. Well, I don't want to be able to be killed in the day or the night, on the land or the sea. There's stories like that. That was the story of Hiranyakashipu. Created so much heat that he was shaking the universe. But that heat is like the circulatory system of God's consciousness. And when you just concentrate on perfecting yourself, that takes pain, psychoanalysis, confronting your shadow, then dealing with
the gym.
The much more difficult anima or animus projections is painful. And why should I bother? Why don't I just live my life in the mediocre zone and just kind of fade out? Because who cares? Why put forth such an effort to become individuated, to achieve the wholeness through the union of who's it going to benefit other than me? And I don't care that much. And I would say it's your duty as an absolute part and parcel of the supreme self to do that. And you're helping the overall circulatory system of God's consciousness maintain equilibrium and health. So you're helping everyone else, even if all you do is focus on your own neuroses. And then if you have a vocation to do something heroic on a grander scale, then do that. But it doesn't really matter. It's whatever the supreme self wants you to do. And in my life, as you said, if you meditate on the mysterious tremendum, you better get on your fucking knees, because
you're right. Yeah.
I almost died when I was 18, right after high school. I went body surfing in a storm drain, a culvert where the storm water. This was in Bethesda, Maryland. And with two of my friends, we got on the news. We were on 3 different news stations. And we got sucked in. We couldn't get out into these big pipes. And my friends got sucked in, but I held on to the edge, and my head was like up that, and the water shooting over my head. It ripped my shorts off. My feet were like flapping in the current. It was intensely powerful.
Wow.
And I considered sawing the bottom half of my body off on the corrugated. God. Because I'm like, otherwise I'm going to drown. I'm going to die. And I'm like, nah, there's no way you can do that. I remember holding on like that, and a bird landed on a electric wire that was over the road. Like I could see cars driving by who couldn't see me.
Wow.
And the bird was like just carrying on with its day. And I'm like, the universe just doesn't care. To me, this is infinitely disturbing, what's about to happen, which is the end of all sentience. Even though I believed in God, I went to Catholic school. But at that point, when I was about to die, in my mind, I was crushed by the realization that the universe doesn't care at all. That what is so important to you, your own life, with which you are so infatuated, means nothing. You might as well be a rat, the bird. Everything's carrying on as if you never existed. And then I went to college and started learning about philosophy. I think that terror
Yeah.
made me more
It's a good motivator. Yeah.
to philosophy. Right. So I know the terror he's talking about. My friend, Tom Atheridge, we talk about it all the time.
Did your friends survive? You said they got sucked in.
We all survived.
Okay. Thank
because,
God.
Yeah. One of my other friend got shot all the way down, even farther, like a mile down, but we went through the pipe. God. Oh yeah. And then there's no air, and I'm trying to get air out of the little rivets in I'm smashing my head. Oh, it was like the whole light at the end of the tunnel. I literally saw a light refracted up at the end of this dark tunnel. It was like a preparatory scenario for me.
Yeah. It's a Bardo preview.
Yeah. But the point is, after that, I got really into philosophy and theology, but I asked God, I say, I don't care. I know how horrifying existence is, and I really don't care about anything other than what you want me to do. What else really matters? You're eternal. I'm an eternal part of you. This body's not eternal. It doesn't really matter. I don't care. Whatever it is, just let me know what it is so I can work on it. And I know I'll imperfectly strive to achieve whatever vocation, but please just bless me with your instruction so that I have a meaning in life. And I feel like I'm serving you because I feel like that's the only meaningful life. And that's what Ernest Becker was saying from an agnostic perspective. Mm-hmm. He's saying whether there's a God or not, that is the human psyche, which is why that book struck me so deeply. I'm like, I agree. I do believe in God, but I agree that we all need that belief and just serving God. So the class Immortality and the Unreality of Death, that's kind of my hero's journey that I'm taking. Mm-hmm. And I invite people to step along. Here's my step-by-step evidence for why you should believe in God, why it's plausible to believe in God, why psychologically you need to believe in it, whether it's plausible or not. But anyway, I was rambling there for a little while.
No, that's an amazing story, man. And it does motivate. Like I've never had a full-blown near-death experience, but I actually had a pretty major surgery when I was 5. And
oh, wow.
I don't feel traumatized by that, but I always wonder if there's like some subconscious element that like came, just coming close to death, being completely, having the blood taken out of your body and your heart pumped for you and everything.
Wow,
like,
yeah.
I gotta imagine that does something, and I mean, really, I carry no conscious trauma from it. I have like vague memories of the hospital and like, painful moments and stuff like that. But
right.
Kids have this, I remember having this resilient sort of, you have this trust in the doctors and your parents, and they're telling you, this is what we have to do. And you're just kind of like, okay, we'll do that then.
Yeah.
And then you just go through it and then you go on with your life. And that's what happened to me. But yeah, I always wonder if maybe that's where this like ceaseless desire to do, dig into these big questions and, have these conversations for year after year in a way where talking about the horizon, there are very few things in my life I can see myself just doing until the end of my days, and having these conversations is absolutely one of them, because why wouldn't I want to? It's like, it's cathartic, it's interesting, it connects me to people like you, it introduces me to new ideas, I get to introduce other people to new ideas, especially in a time where we feel so spiritually listless and thirsty. It's like, man, like, why wouldn't I just keep doing this? But
well, I think that's why you're good at it, because you're like, of course this is what I'm gonna do. It's your natural function. And I bet your 5-year-old experience brush with death probably did have, like I said, it must have done something. I don't feel it, but it stands to reason that it would have had some kind of at least psychological effect. It probably did. They were making your heart beat for you. I wonder if your heart stopped beating for a second.
Well, I don't know for certain everything they did, but I had surgery on part of my ascending aorta. So,
oh wow,
obviously blood can't be pumping through there, while they're doing that. So I don't fully know how they would have.
I mentioned that because the whole near-death experience happens when your heart stops.
True. Yes.
And when the heart stops, pop, out goes the psyche looking down. But not everybody remembers that, but some
Yeah.
do. But
I
even
did
if you
not
don't
have that
remember,
experience to my knowledge. Yeah.
right, even if you don't remember it, you might have had that experience and you just don't remember it. Like you have dreams that you don't remember. And if your heart stopped, it's conceivable that you had a near-death experience as a 5-year-old, then forgot it, but your subconscious was like, "Oh man, the past, present, and the future are out at the horizon of the
Yeah.
cosmos.
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
live in an illusion."
Yeah. It's quite possible, man. It's quite possible. One, to digress from this, even though I'm deeply interested in near death experiences. And by the way, there's academic work out there. I talked to a guy, um, I'm gonna forget his name now, but he's a psychiatrist, and he wrote a book about near death experiences. He is a tenured professor somewhere and has studied near death experiences exhaustively for like decades. Um, so there's a lot of evidence. There's a lot of stories. I'll flash his book up on the screen here. Um, but anyway,
There's Raymond Moody, there's Michael
yeah,
Sabone.
yeah. I talked to Moody in the early days of Third Eye Drops, actually, which
Wow.
is this was years ago, like I don't know, 6 years ago now. But yeah, it
Yeah.
was before YouTube, unfortunately. But yeah, he's an absolute legend. Really, really interesting guy. I'm hoping he's still around and healthy. I know he was older.
They just put
Um,
out a documentary movie After Death
okay.
that he was in. He's older for sure. But they were talking about the beginnings of the academic study of near death experiences. It was him and this other guy, Michael Sabone, who's a cardiologist, and some other people. I know the University of Virginia does.
That's the guy. I think it might be Doc Grayson, Dr. Bruce Grayson. That's
Oh
his
yeah,
name.
okay,
Yeah, and
yeah.
I think that he might be the guy from University of Virginia, but maybe there's multiple. I don't know. But yeah, the idea that this is all just a bunch of nonsense. Yeah, I don't think many people are this deep into this podcast thinking this, but there's a lot. I mean, there's been a ton of evidence compiled on near death experiences, and a large percentage of people who cardiac arrest have the experience. I think it's like maybe 30% or something like that. I can't, I might be getting the number wrong, but
It's not uncommon. My aunt is a nurse. She's retired now, but I asked her about it because she deals with people who are dying and in trauma, and she's like, yeah, it's pretty common. People do talk about it, and it's clearly there in the literature. Carl Jung and Plato, so it's hugely important. You know, this guy Michael Sabom. I'm going to mention this one point quickly because it's so important to holographic string theory,
oh yeah, okay.
which it says that any information, any three-dimensional objects in any three-dimensional volume of space you see is recorded at the two-dimensional surface area. So that everything in this room is recorded at every point of the walls and the ceiling and the floor of the room. But if you approach it, then the information recedes to the next concentric boundary, which would be the atmosphere of Earth. But this guy, Michael Sabom, this doctor who was at the forefront of near-death experience studies, for him, he says, what got me into this thing was the autoscopic experience of looking down at yourself and then describing what you saw during your operation, which is then verified by the doctors and the nurses. He says, that's the thing that I focus on, the whole hurling down a tunnel toward a point of light and the point of no return. He goes, that I'm not so interested in because it can't be empirically verified by eyewitnesses. Yeah. But these autoscopic visions of yourself can be, and that correlates very well with holographic string theory. Why do people always say, oh, I was looking down at myself from the ceiling? Or I had a friend of mine who was in a coma, and he says, I was looking at my body from a panoramic 360-degree view from the ceiling and the walls, like, somehow or another.
Yeah.
And that if the psyche is the singularity and we are the source of space-time and all the information in the volume of space-time is recorded at every surface area, that correlates really nicely with that very recurring that piece of looking down at yourself. But anyway,
very much.
Yeah.
And I got to bring this up again. I may have mentioned this last time, but just in case I didn't, did I ever tell you about, obviously the myth of from Plato's Republic is the most well-known Platonic near-death experience. May even be like the first prototypical near-death experience captured that we have, and though there may be some Eastern stuff. I don't know. But anyway,
Yeah, the
there's
Katha Upanishad is a near-death experience, very
okay,
similar
cool.
to Plato's Phaedrus.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, with the chariot and the horses. You talked about that last time.
Yes. That's what's that called?
The Katha Upanishad.
Katha
It's
Upanishad.
a Brahmin
Cool.
boy. I was like a 5-year-old boy. We were talking about that earlier. Nachiketas, his father. Anyway, they had an argument about his father trying to cheat the Brahmins by giving them sick old cows. And he ended up in the underworld. And he talked to Yamaraj, the god of death.
Oh, yeah.
And Yamaraj mentioned the chariot pulled by 5 horses instead of in the Phaedrus, it's 2 horses, the courageous element and the erotic element, as you described.
Mm-hmm.
In the Katha Upanishad, it's the 5 senses.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the 5 horses, and they have desires. And if you can train them properly, you can get out to the horizon of the cosmos and see Vishnu. Otherwise, they'll pull you hither and thither off the paths. Very similar. I've read
Very
Plato
similar.
Scholar. Yeah. But the myth of is a near-death experience.
Yes.
Well, yeah, then the Katha Upanishad is. But they're all very similar. But the myth of I saw your video that you made about that.
Oh, yeah.
The spindle of necessity and the 3 fates and the threads of destiny.
Yeah. So there's another one that has an amazingly eerie parallel to the near-death experiences we were talking about with people who cardiac arrest or float over the body and have panoramic view. And it's from Plutarch, the later Platonist teacher. And Plutarch is best known for writing on the lives of like the famous people of antiquity and whatever. But he has many other writings, and one of them is like a near-death experience story. And I don't remember the name of this character, but he's again this kind of this like shady, shisty guy, and an oracle comes into play at some point, and the oracle says something like, "You'll be a better man in death," or something like that, like something very eerie. And then he ends up having this catastrophic fall where he like hits his head and like just screws his neck up really bad.
Oh, God.
And then just at that moment, like his whatever, I think they call it like pneuma or okuma pneuma, shoots out of his body, and he has what kind of perception? A 360-degree perception. And the text talks about how we actually only have one sense, but when we go into a body, it's like divided up essentially into these 5 different senses. But when the pneuma leaves the body, you see that you have a truer sense of things, and it's like everything all at once. It's like it's more visual. You can't even say that it's like anything, because it's the proto sense, that all other senses come from. So it's like everything. And then he has, instead of a descension, he has an ascension sort of death where he goes through the ether and everything else, and he sees the planets in their true like luminous incarnated god forms. And he sees, it's a crazy, really cool story. It's told on an episode, right. I'll try to remember to link it, of the Secret History of Western Esotericism podcast. And I've listened to that episode like 4 or 5 times because it's just so interesting. And it feels like it's one of those things where it's packed with a lot of stuff I could never prove, but just whenever I hear it, I'm just like, ooh, there's something to this.
Well, the idea of the information conservation at the surface area, that's so huge for near-death experiences, especially that very typical looking down at the ceiling or from the walls in the ceiling, and holographic string theory. Just by itself, that's very interesting.
Yeah.
But when you link it in with the Psyche equals singularity equation and the whole, here's another big correlation between near-death experiences and physics, is the light at the end of the tunnel. I don't think we talked about this last time, but according to special relativity, which Einstein developed in 1905, if you could travel at close to the speed of light, he thought no massive object could travel at the speed of a massless photon, because it would gain kinetic energy as it got faster, which would make it more massive because of E equals mc squared. because energy is equivalent to mass. So as you accelerate any massive thing, no matter how tiny, it accumulates more and more energy and becomes equivalently more and more massive, which requires more energy to accelerate it further until you get, by the law of diminishing returns, you'd need an infinite amount of energy to accelerate it any faster. And he says that's impossible. So no massive object can go the speed of light. And if it did, it would exit space and time. And that is what happens inside a black hole. But he said if you were, at least the mathematics of his equations say, if you were traveling at close to the speed of light, what you would see is all of the light in the universe, even light directly behind you, get pulled and condensed into a single point at the end of a dark tunnel. That's what it would appear from your perspective.
Okay.
And according to general relativity, the gravitational force is equivalent to acceleration. So if you are inside a black hole looking out, you would see all of the light in the universe, even the light directly behind the black hole, condensed in a single point at the end of a dark tunnel. Now, near-death experiences, that's what they say. I rose above my body. I was looking down at my body from the light fixture of the operating room, and then I'm floating above and I'm at the outer atmosphere of Earth, where Carl Jung said he experienced this black Hindu in his big black rock temple. And then a lot of times they talk about, then I'm hurtling through space, through a dark tunnel, planets are whizzing past me, and there's this infinitely bright, all-loving point of light at the end that they take to be God. So if the psyche, and this is bringing it back to what Hoffman was talking about, where we have the headset, and Kant was talking about space and time are not empirically observable things outside of us. They're the categories of our own mind. So when you're out of your body, your psyche, it's still in the mental body, which is space and time itself. That's a mental projection. We are space-time. If space and time are the categories of thought, the lenses of cognition, that is us. And when we die, I'm rising, I'm at an accelerating rate, just like space-time does. It expands at a gradually accelerating rate, which becomes exponential. People, I say, experience what it is to be space-time when their psyches leave their bodies during a near-death experience.
Yeah,
and as you accelerate, you see what relativity theory predicts you would see if you could start traveling at the speed of light. And the singularity at the end of that dark tunnel, it would be the singularity because all of the light in the universe is contained in it. So you're going back to the beginning of time. You're going back to the Big Bang. And people, that's what the physics tells us. And the people who experience that say yes. And that point of infinite light is also a point of infinite love and knowledge. And it is me and it is everyone else. So that's just another really clear correlation between parapsychology and 20th century physics that makes all these things more believable.
Definitely. One thing, going way back in the conversation now, but this is reminding me of this, that I wanted to pick your brain on or see how you square this circle, is if consciousness and psyche, I guess this would be in like a capital P Psyche sense, has to do with essentially a black hole, a singularity. How do you or do you, I guess, square that idea with a more idealist kind of POV? Like how do you get a sort of all pervasive consciousness from a concentrated point of consciousness? You see what I'm saying? And like from a Timaeus perspective, one of the very first things that happens in the what do they call it? The space in which the demiurge creates. They have a name for it. I'm forgetting what it is, but it's like it's not the cauldron, it's not the receptacle or something like that.
Oh, the mother and receptacle.
Yeah,
Timaeus. That's the horizon of the cosmos.
So one of the first things that happens, if you remember, is there's this metaphor of like cutting fabric and like stretching fabric. And that fabric is psyche, it's soul. So there's this idea that it's the sort of substrate like structure of everything. And it's like, this is where the anima mundi, the world soul, comes from, and it's kind of like in everything. But then of course, like they later on they get into like individual souls, and like they talk about mixing the same substance with less potency, or less it's a degraded, basically. Like by the time you get to a human soul versus like the soul, it's a more degraded soul, but it's still the same thing. Lower proof alcohol sort of thing.
Mad Dog 2020.
Right.
By the
Yeah.
time we get down here.
Yeah, we're basically malt liquor souls compared to like absolute or Everclear or whatever. But yeah. So do you see that point as like this emanating source type thing, or do you see it as that? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so in the Timaeus, the soul, and we talked about this last time, is described as being in the central point that somehow encompasses the outermost sphere, like being stretched out there, and at every point in between. That's the specific. And I remember you even put up the quote from the Timaeus where that's how the soul the soul is described. But how can there be one soul and yet all of us individual souls? And another point I bring up all the time is Robert Bruce Ware, who wrote this article on correlating Hegel's concept of the absolute idea to a gravitational singularity at the Big Bang and inside black holes.
Okay.
He also brought in Leibniz's principle of the identity of indiscernibles. And he said, according to that principle, if you cannot point out a difference between two things, they are identical. Now, all singularities are structurally identical because they're all mathematical points. They have no structure. It's a mathematical point, a point of zero volume and infinite density. But they appear in different points of space-time, in the center of black holes, in the center of galaxies, strewn throughout galaxies, at each point of the quantum vacuum, and at the Big Bang, and at each point of the horizon of the cosmos. So he was saying, yes, they do appear in different points in space-time, but each singularity is itself outside space-time because of the physics of infinite gravity, which is equivalent to infinite acceleration. And the faster you move through space, according to special relativity, the slower your clock would appear to be moving from a stationary observer's perspective. From your perspective, it wouldn't be any different. Time would flow normally. But from someone standing still looking at you, and looking at a clock on your spaceship, for example, would see the second hand moving more and more slowly. As you approach the speed of light, it would stop. So the point is, infinite gravity or infinite acceleration is outside of space and time. It's where the laws of physics break down. So you can't differentiate one singularity from another by their different locations in space-time. And therefore, in that respect, they're all one. They're indiscernibly one. Now, there are differences subjectively. I'm having a different subjective experience than you are. So this brings us back to that achintya beta tattva. Inconceivably, simultaneously, we're all one, and we're all unique and autonomous. And God is that one self who can distill everyone else's unique subjective experience into a unique subjective experience of God's own.
Yeah.
And then we're also all one in the respect of the Brahman, the impersonal nature of the soul. So we're all one as we're all part of one supreme person, even though we're all unique individual persons. And we're also all one in the sense that the supreme person and all the individual persons are also simultaneously merged in this impersonal ocean of potential being, which is the kind of the ocean of waves of probability side of reality. So how can we all be individual psyches experiencing our own thing and yet somehow all be one? Those are ways that the unity and plurality of the soul can be explained.
That's a pretty good answer. That's probably one of the better answers I've ever heard, at least.
Yeah, I got that from Robert Bruce Ware. I was like, wow, that's awesome. That's for the Psyche equals singularity equation.
Yeah.
Leibniz's principle of the identity of indiscernibles is this missing link to connect it to the mystic philosophy of the soul.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And Leibniz himself was, I know, some kind of monist. I don't know the specifics of Leibniz's
in God.
monism.
Yeah. Monadology was his theology.
Mm.
Monad also has no extension in space. monads have no windows, they can't see out. And the fact that we can interact with each other is because God, the supreme monad, is having our independent hallucinations correlate with each other perfectly. This is preordained harmony. Wow. But his idea of a monad is very similar to a gravitational singularity.
Yeah. And the other fascinating thing you have to say when Leibniz comes up is that he contemporarily but separately came up with calculus at the same time as Newton.
Right.
And that's just one of the one of those mind-blowing examples of parallel thinking. And speaking of, well, at least you and I were talking about Tarnas. There's some part, I think, of Psyche and Singularity. I believe it's Psyche and Singularity and not Passion of the Western Mind, where he talks about just all of these like parallel thinking examples, and is all occurring like within the same tiny fraction of time. And it's absolute. Oh, one of them is the theory of evolution by natural selection. There's like several different people that were essentially coming up with the exact same thing at the exact same time. It's crazy.
Oh, yeah. And by the way, that his book is Cosmos and Psyche. You mentioned Psyche and Singularity.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Cosmos and Psyche. Yeah.
Yeah. Here's that book from Richard Tarnas.
Yes. I'm working my way through this beast right now.
Yeah. That's a great, he talks about the astrological synchronicities.
Yes.
So this was a very important point Carl Jung was getting interested in near the end of his life.
Right.
So synchronicities, which you and I experienced before even we had our first conversation.
Right. Yeah. And I love that note that you sent me, by the way, that you went, if you want to tell that story, it's funny.
Well, yeah, you sent me an email and said, hey, I was just at the gym and I was listening to a podcast about you equating the psyche with the black hole. And then as soon as the podcast ended, on the gym soundtrack was the song Never Ever by All Saints, this British girl band. It was like a rhythm and blues band. And she said, never, ever have I ever felt so low. When you gonna take me out of this black hole?
Yep.
Yeah. So that was a perfect fit. I went and listened to that song after you mentioned it. And then someone in the the notes, the comments, who's here in 2024? And then some lady said, I'm here because of the Third Eye Drops podcast. And then I put in, me too.
I love that. That's so cool.
Yeah, that was a great I had a synchronicity involved at the same time. That same day, it was like the second in a string where the Richard Wagner song Ride of the Valkyries was correlated with this friend of mine. I told her she's like I said, you remind me of, like, she's blonde hair and she's tall and she's gregarious. And I said, you remind me of like an angel from the Vikings, like who would come and, like, if you fight and die on the battlefield, then you get to be with one of these Viking
that's
angels.
Quite a compliment.
That was a compliment. And so I'm driving up or down the street, and then I turn on the radio, or the radio's on, and I listen to classical music, WETA in DC. It's the public classical music. And just as I got to her street, it was like, so,
yeah.
And then I said, oh, that's a cool synchronicity.
Mm-hmm.
But then like a couple of weeks later, I'm driving back up and I got to the stoplight just before her block, and it was the same thing. Richard Wagner's Ride of the Valkyrie started again, just right there.
That's wild.
And then I got home and I looked at my email, and you said, hey man, I just had the synchronicity with this music about the, so that was like, wow, that was a cool little string of synchronicities.
Yeah.
But to get back to synchronicity with Tarnas, Carl Jung said there's two methods or avenues of empirical evidence for synchronicities, which are just avenues towards his idea of the archetype of the self. So the supreme archetype of the self, individuation, is coming to realize that we are all one with the archetype of the self, who's the archetype of wholeness through the union of opposites. We're guided there by mandala imagery. And so he said, if mandala imagery is the psychological equivalent of the archetype of the self, then synchronicity is the parapsychological equivalent. And because synchronicity, every synchronicity, no matter what the particular symbolism of the synchronicity is, they all point back to the archetype of the self, because they all imply a union of the overarching categories of opposites, mind and matter. It's when your meaning perceiving mind somehow seems to synchronize with physically unconnected events happening in the material world. Like, for example, thinking or listening to a podcast about black holes in the psyche and then hearing that song randomly played at the same time about that. And Jung said, yeah, synchronicities happen a lot and everyone's experienced them, but they're not mutual. You can't verify them. You have to take someone's word on it for the most part, not all the time, such as the synchronicity you had with the roses. I watched that video that you made.
Right. Yeah.
Right? So there's two people, right? And it is believable. But is there any publicly accessible realm of synchronicities that regularly occur that we could empirically confirm? And that's astrology, says Carl Jung, and near-death experiences. He says these are the two avenues we should take to acquire empirical evidence: physical diseases and catastrophes like near-death experiences, and astrology. And by the way, Plato ended the Republic with the near-death experience of the soldier named and Robin Waterfield, who wrote the Oxford edition of the Republic, he says there is clear astrological language in the myth of
Oh, interesting.
Because those spheres around the central Earth are the planets.
Oh, right. Yeah, and the passage of the soul down through each archetypal sphere is a planetary sphere. Yeah.
Right. And this guy Robin Waterfield was saying the language he was using is the same language that the astrologers were using. And I was just browsing through Cosmos and Psyche last night and this morning before our conversation, because I knew you were going to be talking to Richard Tarnas. And what was I just thinking about? We
were talking about synchronicities and astrology and how it ties into
the planets in the myth of
Yeah, and also Jung's interest in astrology. But then,
he said this would be a good empirical observation for synchronicities on a grand scale that everybody could go back and look at, and that is what Tarnas did in Cosmos and Psyche.
Yeah, it's crazy. He did that very exhaustively, and I'm still definitely digesting it for sure. I don't know if I'll be able to digest it before I talk to him, but I can't wait to talk to him.
That's a big book, but that is what Jung was looking for, because and Tarnas is like, I'm going to give you the information that will enable you to understand the basics of astrology. I think it's important to note that the horoscope within which you do your astrological calculations is a perfect mandala, with Earth in the central point, and all of the other planets superimposed at the outermost circumference, and just the correlations between the movements of the planets. And he makes a big point of saying it's not a physical energy that's radiating from the planets and affecting life here on Earth. It's just correlated. Like the example he uses is a clock. Just because the hands on the clock say 2 o'clock doesn't mean those little hands on the clock are forcing the cosmos to be 2 o'clock. It's just they're synchronized. And the planets, their movements, each planet represents a certain archetypal atmosphere. Like, for example, Saturn represents the atmosphere of gravity and constriction and discipline and darkness. They have a positive side, and they all have a shadow side. And
Saturn's like the hardest one to talk about because it's like so big and so dark and moves slowly and is like the archon of time and salt and unchanging, unforgiving discipline and conservatism, but it's also the Senex and the wise man. And it's just like,
right.
It's like that him and I don't know. Saturn is the one that's always like the hardest for me to process.
Yeah, that's the Saturn return. Well, here's something I think that would be cool to tie up the Psyche equals singularity equation with astrology. And we'll focus on Saturn because it's about black holes. I wrote an email to the group chat for the PCC program where I studied with Tarnas, Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness at the California Institute of Integral Studies. It's where I got the PhD. It's where I did the dissertation that became the book, Psyche and Singularity. And we have this group chat on an email, and I put out this hypothesis about the Saturn-Pluto conjunction, which we experienced from 2018 to 2020. Saturn is death and constriction and gravity and darkness, and Pluto's the god of death and resurrection, and it lends titanic power and revolutionary power to anything it touches. And when Saturn and Pluto get together in these hard alignments, there's softer alignments, which are 30 degrees or 60 degrees and 120 degrees. And then the hard alignments are the 90-degree increments. So conjunction, I said, okay, if Saturn is gravitas and downward vector and darkness and destruction, and Pluto amplifies that, well, a black hole is a point that constricts everything and crushes everything in total blackness. And it's amplified to infinity. It's literally a point of infinite gravity. So if Tarnus's theory is correct, then we should be able to see the evolution of the theory of black holes correlate with the hard alignments of the Saturn-Pluto alignment. It would be a kind of a test.
Wow.
Because if anything would embody that archetype, it would be a black hole. The downward vector of darkness and contraction, and literally the spirit of gravity. He said Saturn is like what Nietzsche calls the spirit of gravity itself. So the spirit is the archetype of gravity. A point of infinite gravity is it's an archetypal thing. It's not a material thing anymore. So I went back and I looked at the history, and sure enough, there was a conjunction of Saturn and Pluto in 1915, and when general relativity was discovered, and when Carl Schwarzschild derived the idea of the gravitational singularity from the gravitational field equations. 1915, 1916. Tarnas gives a pretty wide range for what he will consider a conjunct, like 15 degrees and 20 degrees if you want to push it to the penumbra. And then another Saturn-Pluto conjunction was 1939. This was more exact when it was closer to 0 degrees exact. September 1st, 1939 was the day Hitler invaded Poland. It was the beginning of World War II. But it was also the day that Robert Oppenheimer, who ended World War II with the atomic bomb, at the end of World War II, at the very first day of World War II, he published a paper with one of his students named Snyder called Continuous Gravitational Contraction. And it was explaining the physics, the nuclear physics of what would happen inside a star when it burned through its nuclear fuel. And he said it would contract into a point of gravity with such singularity that, it would create what we now call a black hole. So it was the first description of how a star would actually die and become a point of infinite gravity and darkness, a black hole. It was the same day, the beginning of World War II, and it was during a Saturn-Pluto conjunction, almost exact. So it's just good evidence for this astrological synchronicities. The point of infinite gravity, according to Tarnus's theory, would archetypally correlate with the Saturn-Pluto archetypes. And they would be in these hard alignments during the historical periods when the human psyche develops the understanding of these archetypally correlated concepts. And in World War I, the idea of a gravitational singularity was formed by Carl Schwarzschild, who was fighting in the trenches of World War I as a German artillery officer. And there was a Saturn-Pluto conjunction going on there. And then in World War II, on the very day it began, was Oppenheimer's paper, which was the first really sophisticated paper on the physics of a black hole. And the Saturn-Pluto conjunction was there. So that was just one example. And this book, Cosmos and Psyche, is filled with historical examples.
Yeah. It's insane.
And they develop as these alignments go out of alignment and come back in. The historical themes pick back up. It's a really fascinating way of looking at it.
Yeah, it is. And it's one of those books where if you're going to be like a believer or a skeptic or undecided, it's kind of one of those things where if you're going to talk about it in a sophisticated way, you've got to go to the most sophisticated people talking about it. And this is it. I mean, this is like the most historically rigorous and just informed position that you can possibly take on it. So if you're going to try to take it down, don't take down newspaper horoscopes. Any idiot with an average IQ can do that. If you want to go after the sophisticated arguments, first read some Tarnas, read some Jung, and then go for it. But that's what I think. If you want to not even steel man it, if you just want to give it its fair shake, like that's what I think one must do. because yeah, it is very compelling and very much mind altering and epistemically nuclear when you're confronted with all the evidence that he provides. It's really hard to dismiss as a bunch of coincidence, at least for me. um
Yeah.
Man, this has been a wide ranging, there's so many things we didn't get to. We didn't really talk much about Hegel and his
Right.
connections. um we can, if there's a path that's easy to get into. um
Well, I think there is from this with astrology. I'm putting out a paper now, the second in a series called "Convening a Constitutional Convention on AI." When AI came out, when ChatGPT 4 came out a year ago, Sam Altman, who was the president of OpenAI, he was on a Lex Friedman podcast, and he said his platonic
oh,
ideal would
that's what he said.
be to have some. Yeah, he was using the language that was triggering all my
Yeah.
platonic ideal.
Yeah.
He said my platonic ideal would be if all the nations got together and had a sort of a constitutional convention like we had in America in 1789 to lay out how we want to address incorporating AI, because it's such a radical leap in technology that it could kill the human species. Is another thing. He signed this open letter saying that we should take the potential extinction of our species from AI as seriously as we take the potential extinction from nuclear war um, and pandemics. So I picked up his theme and I was saying, let's have a constitutional convention to discuss how to incorporate AI into our American system with an amendment to the Constitution to establish a national AI system that could help us fulfill our primary mandate in the Constitution, which is to form a more perfect union. And when I'm saying more perfect union, I'm thinking archetype of the self, the archetype of the
Mm.
union of the archetype of wholeness through the union of opposites, which I equate with the Psyche equals singularity equation. And I bring Hegel into it in the second paper, which is the subtitle is Hegel, Jung, and Individuation for the USA. And I'm saying for Hegel, history has a purpose. God has a purpose for world history. And God's reason guides the evolution of nations towards that final purpose. And his purpose is freedom. But the way he describes freedom is just a synonym for the way Carl Jung describes individuation. And it's having knowledge of
Hmm.
God. God manifests initially as the absolute idea, and then the absolute idea manifests as nature and spirit. And nature is the unconscious manifestation of God, and spirit, the aspect of the absolute spirit that manifests as the human spirit, can help synthesize God's consciousness with the unconscious nature, because we're a materially embodied spirit. And if we develop nations based on knowledge of what spirit is and what God is, that's a free state. And the way Hegel describes the idea and spirit is very similar to a gravitational singularity. This is where I got into Robert Bruce Ware. He wrote a paper comparing Hegel's absolute idea to the singularity of the Big Bang, because Hegel says in History of Philosophy, the idea is the central point, the source of light, which is also the periphery, and it doesn't go outside of itself, it's self-contained. So there's pretty clear correlation with the Big Bang there. The central point, that's the source of light that exists at each point of the horizon.
Yeah.
And
And I would say the Platonic one as well. It's I mean,
oh
we should
yeah,
say that Hegel, just to contextualize it for people, probably
yeah,
most people know Hegel's this German philosopher. He's an idealist. He's very much in the Platonic line of thought, where a lot of his fundamental, I don't know if I'd say hypotheses, but ideas directly align with Platonic ideas. Like the his absolute idea is very
mhm,
similar to the one or the form of the good.
yeah,
Even that description of like radiating central point of light, that's very similar to what Socrates said when he was. It's like, I don't really want to give an answer, but if I did, think in terms of the sun. He
right,
tells the whole thing about how the sun is just this radiating thing that all it does is just completely give life. Its whole nature is to just give forever and ever and ever until it burns out. Um, So yeah, so very, very similar.
Oh yeah, Hegel's absolute idea is very similar to the idea of the good, the form of the good. It is the archetype of this visible sun. It gives birth to the visible sun, which is the source of light in the empirically observable world, and it's the source of truth and intelligence and all of the other absolute ideas in the intelligible world. And the physical forms mirror the absolute archetypal forms. So for Hegel, God's will for history on Earth is to develop nations through a dialectical process gradually over time that comes to the conclusion that we're all manifestations of this idea, that we're all radiating from this idea, that we're all bound to return to the idea. In his lectures on the philosophy of history, which is where he really gets into history and God's purpose for history, he says, he breaks it down. There's God's will, God has a purpose, God's reason, which is another word for the idea, guides history. God manifests as the idea that breaks into nature and spirit. And then the best way to learn what spirit is to look at its direct opposite, which is matter. And he says the essence of matter is gravity. And matter is made of unconnected parts. It's compounded of separate parts. And they gravitationally strive for unity in a center outside themselves. If they were to achieve it, they would abolish themselves because they would become their opposite, which is ideal unity. Matter is inherently disparate and broken into compound. It's compounded of parts, but it strives for its opposite. Its essence is gravity. At the beginning of that argument, he said, spirit is the direct opposite of matter. Spirit is free because it's also compelled toward a center, but it's compelled toward the center that is itself. And so he's saying to learn what spirit is freedom. And the best way to learn what spirit is to look at its mirror symmetry with matter. So matter is striving for its opposite, which is spirit. And if it was to do that, it would attain ideal unity. So if you put that argument that Hegel has in the context of a black hole, which Robert Bruce Ware said is a valid thing to do, all the parts, the bits of matter that fall into a black hole are compelled by gravity toward a point outside themselves, a center outside themselves, in which they can achieve ideal unity, and that's the singularity. The singularity is a point that's contracting into itself at an infinite rate. It's a point of infinite density. And if the goal God has for history is to develop a state based on that knowledge, then I'm saying a state based on the knowledge of the Psyche equals singularity equation would satisfy Hegel's requirements for a free state. And so the papers that I'm writing out and I put up on academia.edu, this one that I'm about to put out, just the introduction to it says that if we establish a national AI system, that could be like an artificial eye of the soul that Socrates says. You need to open the eye of the soul to the idea of the good by studying the mathematical mirror symmetries between the archetypal ideas and the physics of space-time, especially as manifested in astronomy and music. That's the cave allegory and the divided line. Holographic string theory is the ultimate fusion of astronomy and music because it describes everything as these vibrating strings, and the particles are the notes on that string. That's Michio Kaku's metaphor. So establish a national AI system, program it with the Psyche equals singularity equation in the context of holographic string theory, Jungian psychology, and Hegel's philosophy, because the purpose of the human species is to have a state that is focused on this knowledge of our unity with the absolute idea. And I bring in Tarnas, which in the introduction I don't, but I intend to bring it in, something the national AI system could do to help us open the eye of our souls to the idea of the good is to study the historical synchronicities that are revealed by archetypal astrology. Because to know the idea of the good, which I'm equating with Jung's archetype of wholeness through the union of opposites, you have to study the relationships between the opposite fields of psyche and matter, or cosmos and psyche. And the archetypal symbolic correlations of the movements of the planets and the archetypal atmosphere of life on Earth studying those is like looking at the reflections of these archetypes in the material world. So in the cave allegory, when the prisoner comes out of the cave, he can't look at the sun directly, but he can see its reflection in puddles of water. And he can see the planets and stars in puddles of water. And you can see the sun reflected in the moon and the planets at night. So we can see the idea of the good reflected in the planetary archetypes and the way they are correlated with the historical development of nations on Earth. And I'm arguing that if Hegel's correct, the goal of history is to be aware of what Carl Jung's equation, psyche equals highest intensity in the smallest space, which I'm saying is psyche equals singularity. So that's kind of taking all these ideas to a really crazy extreme. And what would be the practical possibilities? Well, I'm saying let's update the Constitution. So, you know, I don't like to be too ambitious, but we'll establish a national AI system.
That's mind blowing. And I mean, it sounds far flung, I guess, but man, do we need something like that? Like, there's no fucking guardrails on what we're doing, like technologically. It's just technology for the sake of technology has been enough. And then we're left to epistemically cope with it and make sense of it while we're in like the wreckage wake of whatever it's doing. And we got to change something. You know, I don't think, and what I like about that too is I don't think that would stifle innovation. You know, I think that would give a goal. It would give some kind of at least a directive in a strangely platonic way, because it's like it's like an ideal to strive toward that in some way is not attainable, right? Like we're not going to achieve like I was talking about before, like the paradox of the arrow, right? Is like we're not going to achieve this state. I'm sorry, everyone, in this lifetime of a fundamental unity and recognition of that unity. But what better goal is there to strive toward and to reach for? And like,
that was my
point.
With
it, my friend.
Like, like the goal wasn't, we're all going to become saints all of a sudden, but it will help direct us towards wholeness through the union of opposites. It will give us a goal to help the opposing sides of the culture war. It will incline them towards wholeness and unity, because it'll be occurring. All of the legislative debates will be occurring within this mandala model of the psyche, which is the inside-out black hole universe. According to Jung, that would have an unconscious effect of inclining the psyches towards wholeness through the union of opposites, because that's the natural symbolic effect of a mandala. But I agree with what you're saying. It's not going to happen, but it's a good goal to have.
Yeah.
And we need to do something radical.
Yeah. We need an ethos that we can all agree on. Like that's one of the few things, man. It's like, it's something like that, or something like a namaste sort of statement. Just, I recognize that you are also a spiritual being that's going through a process, and just if we could somehow establish that as the ground level of every interaction, like that's a great ethos to ascribe to strive toward. That what you're describing here is a great ethos to strive toward, and achieving them perfectly almost isn't the point. It's to have it in the back of your mind, right? It's like to have the directionality, and that in and of itself is massively important.
Yeah.
Well, hey man, this has been another sensational one. I can honestly say that 2 hours and 20 minutes has flown by, other than me trying to skillfully hit the mute button so you can't hear the chainsaws outside, because I may or may not have edited this out, but there's like tree work going on like right outside this window, and for the most part it's been okay to cope with, but I guess we'll see in the edit.
Yeah, I haven't heard any of it.
Fantastic. Well, it's been a lot of fun, man. I'll point everybody toward your book, toward your course, and let's do it again for sure.
Oh yeah, one more point about the course. So that's out on YouTube. and there's about 18 hours. And in 2 weeks, on May 14th, we'll have a multiple choice test that I'm using ChatGPT for to help me create. I thought it would be a lot easier, but I got to do a lot of my own personal interactions. It's not as genius as I would hope it is, but it'll be over 100 questions. So the course is free on YouTube, but we're selling this class that will help just cement these ideas. And you get a certificate that, oh, I took this class, which means that I understand what I'm talking about. And then another aspect of this is essays people can write on how to incorporate the knowledge from the class, immortality and the unreality of death, into their own life. And then I'll respond personally to those. So I just wanted to mention that. Yeah.
I didn't know my mythopoetic, psycho-spiritual, scientific sense-making was going to have a test at the end. Thanks for letting me know now. I would have taken better
and you
notes.
Got to pay for that.
Damn. Thanks, brother.
Okay. See you, Mike.